In early 2025, U.S. businesses woke up to a new reality. The global economy was already shifting, but President Donald Trump's new wave of tariffs marked a hard reset. Announced with swift and unapologetic clarity, the new tariff strategy impacted every corner of American commerce, from small importers in Ohio to billion-dollar manufacturers in Texas. The message from the White House was unmistakable: America first, trade fair. While the U.S. has always used tariffs as an economic lever, the 2025 surge wasn't just about economic numbers. According to the Trump administration, this move was about national sovereignty, trade imbalances, and punishing bad actors, specifically countries like Mexico, Canada, and China, accused of manipulating trade practices and taking advantage of U.S. markets for decades. Here's what the executive orders included: 25% tariffs on all imports from Mexico, 25% tariffs on all imports from Canada, except oil and energy at 10%, 10% tariffs on all imports from China. This wasn't a random shot across the bow. It was a calculated move under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, a tool granting the president broad powers during a national emergency. The justification: national security and protecting critical domestic industries. The message was clear: if you want to sell to American consumers, play by our rules. Not quietly. Canada and Mexico, once secure trading partners under NAFTA and then USMCA, were furious. They immediately responded with retaliatory tariffs targeting everything from American dairy to industrial equipment. The EU even hinted it would reconsider its own trade relationship with the US if Europe were next. Meanwhile, China, always strategic, waited and then hit back. With surgical precision, it targeted US agricultural exports: soybeans, pork, and corn. Knowing full well these industries supported Trump's voter base. Suddenly, small-town farmers in Iowa and tech giants in California were on the same battlefield. And many didn't know what hit them. Stock markets jolted. Business owners scrambled. Economists warned this could become a full-blown trade war 2.0, bigger than the 2018 to 2019 saga. But beneath the headlines, a bigger story was unfolding. Thousands of U.S. businesses, from family-owned hardware suppliers to global supply chain giants, were forced to rethink everything. Suddenly, CEOs were asking, can we source parts outside of China? Will our customers accept price increases? Should we move manufacturing back to the U.S.? Some companies panicked. Others adapted fast. A Midwest tool manufacturer started building partnerships with Vietnam and India, accelerating their pivot away from China. A retail apparel brand made a bold bet, bringing part of its textile production back to North Carolina. Costly? Yes. But with tariffs rising, it might be a smarter long-term play. Tariffs were no longer just a policy issue, they became a strategic weapon. And if you weren't prepared, you were in the crosshairs. When the 2025 tariffs hit, it wasn't just economists watching spreadsheets light up in red, it was everyday businesses on the ground suddenly caught in the storm. Some were already struggling with post-pandemic cost pressures. Others had barely recovered from supply chain disruptions. And now, a fresh blow, tariffs that added up to millions in unexpected costs overnight. No sector felt the heat faster than automotive. The U.S. imports a vast amount of car parts from Mexico and Canada, from engines to dashboards to electronic chips. When those 25% tariffs came crashing down, car manufacturers were suddenly looking at double-digit increases in production costs. At General Motors' Michigan plant, executives had a dilemma. Pass on the costs to consumers? Risk pricing out American families already facing inflation. Absorb the costs? Watch profit margins evaporate. Move sourcing? Not so simple. It takes years to rebuild a supply chain. Ford, meanwhile, paused plans for a new electric vehicle line due to uncertainty around Chinese lithium-ion battery imports. The tariffs didn't just raise costs, they froze innovation. Tariffs didn't discriminate between Wall Street and the wheat fields. When China retaliated with agricultural tariffs, American farmers were hit hard again. Remember, U.S. agriculture was already battered from earlier trade wars. Many believed those wounds were healing. But 2025 brought a second wave. In Iowa, soybean farmer Rick Dawson described it best. One day I had contracts for the fall harvest. Next day, my Chinese buyers vanished. They're buying from Brazil now. Government relief programs tried to offer short-term aid. But for farmers, it wasn't just about money, it was about markets lost, maybe forever. Big box stores like Walmart, Target, and Dollar General import large volumes of goods from China, electronics, toys, clothing, you name it. Even a 10% tariff translated into billions in extra expenses. But here's the catch, their business model depends on low prices. Raising prices risks losing customers. Absorbing costs means slimmer margins. They were stuck. Smaller retailers felt it more acutely. Take Tina Caldwell, owner of a boutique home goods store in Phoenix. Almost all of my kitchenware is sourced from China. My supplier just upped prices by 12%. I had to raise mine and I lost weekend traffic because of it. Now, Tina's exploring suppliers in Thailand and Vietnam. But shifting sourcing isn't like flipping a switch. It takes months, even years, to build new trade relationships, ensure product quality, and manage logistics. For the tech sector, tariffs posed a unique kind of threat, supply chain complexity. Major American companies like Apple, Dell, and HP rely heavily on components manufactured in China, processors, screens, internal parts. Even a small tariff on an imported chip meant an increase in the cost of the final product. But the bigger concern? Escalation. What if the 10% tariff jumped to 25%? What if China retaliated by halting rare earth mineral exports? This looming uncertainty caused some companies to fast-track diversification plans. Apple had already begun assembling more iPhones in India. Now it was pushing harder than ever. At the same time, smaller startups, which lack Apple's scale and resources, were left vulnerable. One tech startup in Austin delayed its product launch because it couldn't afford the new import costs for its Chinese-manufactured sensors. They adapted fast, shifted sourcing to Vietnam, India, and even back to U.S. factories, negotiated contracts to include tariff clauses, reworked pricing models to protect margins without scaring off customers, and above all, got politically involved, lobbying Congress to pressure the administration for exemptions or relief. Tariffs weren't just an international chess move. For businesses, they were a call to action. By mid-2025, the ripple effects of President Trump's tariff strategy weren't just economic. They were legal, political, and global. The U.S. wasn't operating in a vacuum. Every action triggered a reaction, and now the consequences were hitting in full force. Major industry groups weren't taking the tariffs lying down. Within weeks of the executive orders, lawsuits flooded the federal courts. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, normally cautious about political confrontation, filed a high-profile lawsuit claiming that the administration had overstepped executive authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. The core argument? The president was using national emergency as a blanket justification without specific, immediate threats. Behind closed doors, legal experts whispered about a potential Supreme Court battle, one that could redefine presidential trade powers for decades. At the same time, hundreds of smaller businesses banded together through trade associations. Many couldn't afford prolonged legal battles on their own but saw this as a fight for survival. "This is not about politics," said Michelle Lopez, head of the Importers Coalition. "It's about whether American small businesses can survive the next 5 years." Congressional clashes. While legal battles raged in courtrooms, political warfare broke out on Capitol Hill. Republican lawmakers were split. Pro-Trump conservatives rallied behind the tariffs, framing them as a necessary defense of American workers and sovereignty. Moderate Republicans and most Democrats, however, raised alarms about the economic blowback, especially to small businesses and consumers. Senator Rand Paul publicly questioned the overuse of executive authority. Emergency powers were never meant to be permanent policy tools. A bipartisan bill called the Trade Oversight and Accountability Act was introduced in Congress. It aimed to limit the president's ability to impose tariffs unilaterally and restore more power to Congress over trade decisions. While its passage was uncertain, it gained traction quickly among industries reeling from tariff shocks. It wasn't just the U.S. feeling the pressure. The World Trade Organization, WTO, was forced to intervene. Mexico, Canada, and China filed formal complaints, accusing the U.S. of violating global trade agreements. Although WTO rulings are slow-moving, this signaled growing international frustration. What shocked many was that even U.S. allies in Europe started to distance themselves. Germany's chancellor criticized the U.S. move, warning it would destabilize global markets. France's president called for a unified EU response to protect European industries from potential fallout. Even Japan and South Korea, key U.S. allies in the Pacific, expressed concern, especially as American protectionism made Asian markets more competitive. China, seeing an opportunity, ramped up its Belt and Road diplomacy. It began offering trade incentives to Latin America and Africa, regions previously dominated by U.S. influence. The message was clear: if America won't trade fairly, we will. Meanwhile, Canada signed a fast-track trade deal with the EU, strengthening its European ties and cutting further reliance on U.S. exports. The global trade map was shifting and fast. America's top competitors weren't just adjusting. They were seizing the moment. Back home, things were tense. Polls showed a 50-50 split among Americans. Half believed the tariffs would help rebuild domestic industry. Half feared rising prices and international isolation. In states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, where manufacturing jobs were returning, Trump's policy was hailed as bold and patriotic. But in coastal cities and rural farming towns, fear and frustration grew. Inflation crept up again. Prices on imported goods rose. Small businesses laid off workers. But some factories expanded. Others reopened. The U.S. economy was reshaping itself. Some called it revival, others called it a gamble. Despite the chaos, confusion, and rising costs, American business owners aren't standing still. Across the country, a wave of adaptation is taking place. While some firms are struggling to stay afloat, others are getting creative, turning adversity into opportunity. This part of the story focuses on resilience, how U.S. businesses are adjusting, surviving, and in many cases, thriving in the face of tariffs. For years, the U.S. outsourced manufacturing to China, Mexico, and Southeast Asia to cut costs. But tariffs changed the math. For some, reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. suddenly made sense. In Indiana, Stonehill Lighting, a mid-sized producer of home lighting fixtures, had relied on Chinese suppliers for over a decade. When tariffs hit, their costs ballooned by nearly 20%. Rather than pass it all on to customers, CEO Mark Abrams made a bold move. He reopened a long-dormant factory his father once operated. The startup costs were steep, Abrams admitted. But now I control my supply chain. I'm hiring locally, and customers love the Made in USA label. Stonehill isn't alone. A wave of domestic reinvestment is rippling across the country. States like Texas, Georgia, and Tennessee, with low taxes and business-friendly policies, are seeing manufacturing make a comeback. Many companies are also choosing a middle path, diversification. Rather than relying solely on China, they're sourcing from countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Bangladesh, and India, many of which offer competitive pricing without the tariff penalties. Take Red Fox Gear, a sportswear brand based in Denver. In 2024, 80% of its goods came from China. Now, less than 30%. CEO Sarah Kinsey spent 9 months building new supplier relationships in Southeast Asia. It wasn't easy, she said, but now we're more resilient. If one country faces tariffs or supply issues, we're not sunk. The key lesson? Redundancy, flexibility, strategic planning. In today's trade climate, companies that spread risk are the ones positioned to survive. Some businesses decided the answer wasn't about changing suppliers, it was about changing the whole model. Direct-to-consumer, DTC strategies exploded in 2025. By cutting out middlemen, brands could absorb some tariff costs while protecting margins. One standout example, Barrel & Oak, a Brooklyn-based whiskey brand. Faced with increased glass bottle import tariffs from Mexico, founder Chris Daniels ditched retail chains and started shipping directly to consumers via online orders. His company invested heavily in digital marketing and local distribution hubs. The result? Sales dipped for a month, then exploded. People liked the personal touch. We built a loyal fan base, Daniels said. And guess what? Our profit margin is now higher than it was before tariffs. Behind the scenes, lawyers are playing a big role. Businesses are now writing tariff clauses into contracts, legal terms that protect them from sudden cost increases due to policy changes. These clauses allow companies to renegotiate pricing if tariffs exceed a set threshold, share cost burdens with suppliers, cancel contracts under certain conditions. For example, a Texas-based electronics firm renegotiated with their Taiwanese suppliers to split the tariff burden. It wasn't easy, but both sides understood that collaboration meant survival. To offset rising costs, companies are investing in automation. Robots don't care about tariffs, they just work. In Kentucky, a furniture manufacturer installed new robotic arms on its assembly line. It was a big upfront cost, but it let them reduce reliance on overseas parts and produce more at home, faster. Tariffs pushed us to modernize, said Operations Director Michelle Freeman. In the long run, it's making us better. While the tariff storm hit hard, it also forced innovation. Businesses were pushed to rethink lazy dependencies, old models, and global fragilities. For many, 2025 became the year of rebirth, a painful but necessary shift towards sustainability, agility, and national resilience. America's business engine isn't just tough, it's smart, and when tested, it adapts. With the dust from the 2025 tariff upheaval beginning to settle, the big question now is, what comes next? For American businesses, it's not just about surviving, it's about preparing for the future. The world has changed, and the playbook has to evolve with it. All indicators point to 2026 being a make-or-break year for many companies. Those that took swift action in 2025, whether through reshoring, diversifying supply chains, or automation, are now entering the year with a competitive edge. However, for those who delayed or hoped for a quick reversal in policy, time may be running out. President Trump's administration has signaled that the tariffs will remain in place for the foreseeable future, with additional enforcement on the horizon, including enhanced customs audits, anti-dumping measures, and stricter import documentation. The message is clear. This isn't temporary. Adapt or risk falling behind. Complicating matters is the looming 2026 midterm election season. While tariffs are largely controlled by the executive branch, a change in Congress could affect the administration's ability to expand or adjust policies. Wall Street is already bracing for volatility. If Republicans strengthen their hold on Congress, tariffs could be extended or expanded. If Democrats gain ground, expect heavy pressure to repeal or scale back key parts of the tariff framework. In either case, businesses must prepare for rapid shifts in legislation, volatile market reactions, sudden changes in global alliances and trade deals. In other words, 2026 may be less about what businesses can control and more about how quickly they can respond to change. Another massive trend shaping the future is the rise of regional trade alliances. As the U.S. steps back from certain global trade deals, other nations are filling the void. The EU and China have strengthened ties. Latin American nations are building intra-regional agreements to reduce dependency on the U.S. American businesses that once dominated these markets are now competing with European, Chinese, and even Brazilian firms with lower tariff exposure. To stay in the game, U.S. companies will need to build regional partnerships, open overseas branches, leverage digital trade channels, stay hyper-aware of diplomatic shifts. The most successful American companies of the post-2025 tariff era are unlikely to resemble the giants of old. Instead, we're entering the age of the agile business, fast-moving, adaptable, and laser-focused on risk management. Expect to see a rise in localized supply chains, vertical integration, scenario planning for geopolitical risk, on-demand manufacturing using AI and 3D printing, data-driven forecasting to avoid shocks. In other words, resilience will no longer be a luxury, it will be a requirement. As former Intel CEO Andy Grove once said, "Only the paranoid survive." In today's world, the prepared thrive. Amid the turmoil, there's a silver lining, a renewed focus on American innovation. The tariff upheaval has ignited a fire under the U.S. business community. We're seeing record investment in domestic factories, skilled labor training programs, robotics and advanced manufacturing, regional logistics hubs, smart warehousing and AI-driven procurement. There's a sense, especially among younger entrepreneurs, that America is entering a new industrial age. Not one defined by rusted factories or assembly lines, but one driven by tech, talent, and tenacity. In cities like Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and Salt Lake City, startup ecosystems are booming. They're building everything from microchips to EV batteries to next-gen textiles, all domestically. This is more than reaction. It's reconstruction. If you're a U.S. business owner, executive, or entrepreneur, here's your checklist for navigating what comes next. White heavy checkmark: audit your supply chains for vulnerabilities. White heavy checkmark: explore alternative suppliers and markets. White heavy checkmark: revisit contracts and add tariff protection clauses. White heavy checkmark: invest in workforce training and digital tools. White heavy checkmark: monitor legislation and global trade developments. White heavy checkmark: build in flexibility so you're ready for the next shock. Remember, tariffs are more than numbers on a spreadsheet. They're strategic signals about the direction of a country. And right now, the message from Washington is clear. Build in America. Buy in America. Compete or get out of the way. The future favors the bold. Is your business ready?